Hello and welcome to Game Design Hour. I'm your host, Miles Goldsmith, and on each episode, I interview the people who create the video games you know and love. Now, before I introduce the game and get into the episode, I just wanted to say that this episode was filmed, edited, and published on June 6th, which also happens to be the 2-year anniversary of the launch of Game Design Hour, which is absolutely insane that this show has been around for 2 years. I wanted to thank all of you so much for watching throughout the past 2 years and for the support that you've given to the show. Now, on today's episode, I interviewed one of the amazing developers behind the video game The Last Worker. The Last Worker is a video game that can be played either in VR or on a regular 2D screen, and it follows the last worker at a big corporation, so similar to ones we see in real life, as he tries to take down the corporation from the inside. I will say this interview does have spoilers, so just be warned. The game and the ending will be spoiled in the interview, so just be warned. If you're planning on playing the game, go play the game, come back. Yeah. Without any further ado, let's meet our guest and get into the interview.
Hello.
Hello. How are you doing today?
Good. We finally made it happen. How are you?
I'm doing good.
Hey, my name is Jörg Tittel, and I'm the writer and director of The Last Worker.
So what was the first thing that really sparked your interest in creating and making video games?
Oh, God. The very first time I came across a video game, I was tiny. I have no idea what age I was, maybe like 6 or something, or 7. And a friend of mine had Pong in his basement. And, with a little sort of tyranny wheel crank thing. And it was in the basement where those weird, bizarre objects belonged back then, apparently. And so that was my first, and I was completely mesmerized by it, but it was still a bit of a sort of novelty. And it was like in 1986, I remember the day when, this sort of traveling circus brought a full-size arcade cabinet of Sega's Outrun, the beautiful racing game or driving game, because you don't race anyone in it, you just drive, to my town in Belgium, in Brussels. And I sat down and my feet could barely reach the pedals. And I started playing, and it just took me to a completely different place, different dimension, and it made me feel so good. And I was cruising. And so I think that really unlocked something in me. And since then, I've loved games. So yeah, it was back quite a while, I guess.
How did you first get into the video game industry?
I was studying theater at New York University at the School of the Arts, and I'd been there for about 3, 4, 5, 6 months or something, and didn't have much money. My parents didn't have much money at the time, and living in New York was very expensive. And there was a threat that I might have to actually go back to Europe because it seemed impossible. But so I was a bit depressed about that and sad and anxious. And so I sort of went back to my childhood, crawled back into my comfort zone, which was to think about video games. And I missed this German video game magazine that I used to read while living in Belgium, and I subscribed to it. And I went down into the computer room in the dorm that I was in, and staying in New York, and went to their website and sent them an email saying, like, I'm just reading this magazine. Can I subscribe it out of New York? I doubt it, but can you make an exception for me or whatever? And they sent me an email. A few minutes later, I get an email from the editor-in-chief saying, like, we're actually looking for a U.S. correspondent right now. Would you want to write for us? Do you know how to write? And like, yeah. And so that turned into a career as a game journalist, and that actually allowed me to actually live far more comfortably through my theater studies in New York. So that was the beginning. And since I was already really into meeting the sort of creative geniuses behind a lot of the games that I admired, I'd already been reaching out to a lot of them over because chat platforms and stuff were only just starting out. They were called like ICQ and AOL Instant Messenger and all this kind of stuff. And it was quite easy to reach all the game devs at the time, no matter how well known, because the tech was new, and therefore the first people to adopt it were the more tech savvy people, which was game developers. So suddenly I was talking to some of the leading people in the industry, whether it was like Peter Molyneux, or Dean Carter, and all these amazing people. And so I had connections that way. I was building them rather quickly, and I was starting to meet all these amazing minds. And then eventually I worked for Activision, for Treyarch on the first Minority Report game back in 2000, on the Minority Report game, which was not a very good game. in 2001, I think it was. And then I sort of went back into screenwriting and theater and stuff for a few years, made a few features. There's a big feature coming out next year as well with John Malkovich and a bunch of people that my wife is directing, called A Winter's Journey. But my love has always been in games, and again, my happy place. And so I've never really left them behind, but I sort of had to put them aside for a bit, and now I'm fully back in. Long story.
How did you first think of the idea for The Last Worker?
It was about 2014, I think. It goes back a while. And I went to my local supermarket in London, and they overnight, as if it was like a dystopian pop-up shop, the employees had been replaced by these sort of self-checkout machines, just standing upright. And there was like one of the remaining two employees, and there'd been six there previously, stood by them and was waiting for them to mess up so you could press the restart button or whatever. And I thought it was so crazy to see this happen overnight, how quickly people had become expendable. And I approached the guy who was standing next to the machines, and I said, like, hang on, something is a bit odd here. Like, I see that you're assisting the machines when in fact it should be the other way around. And he said, I know, it's terrible, isn't it? It's like, yeah. I mean, also what I found was quite disturbing about these machines is they looked so boring. Like, I wish they were just Terminators walking around with guns and stuff, because then you'd know you have to hate them and fight back. But the fact that this sort of automation and this replacement of us was so drab and boring and underhanded made it even more intense, And so that was when it started. And then a couple of months later, the BBC here aired this documentary called The Truth Behind the Click. Someone had snuck into an Amazon fulfillment center here in the UK with a hidden camera and filmed what it's like to work in there. And it was like a dystopian game. It was this sort of weird, strangely gamified existence. We have to carry this this ticker and whatever it is, and pick this thing, and it was like counting down the seconds between each package, and you have to push this cart 12 miles a day on concrete and metal with no natural light. And if you didn't make it to the product on time, then it would start beeping and alert all the colleagues around you and your managers that you were messing up, blah, blah, blah. It was just insane. It was like, so this is a game that people are made to play for their survival. And I want to now combine these thoughts and all this dread and stuff into something that will hopefully act both as a warning and also something, a think piece, and something for people to think about this sort of underhanded, bizarre, big tech dystopia that we've all found ourselves in.
What pieces of media inspired different aspects and elements of the game?
Oh, I'm not sure that I can answer that one. To me, it's not about pieces of media. To me, it's all about people. So I just went to the people that I admire the most and hope that they would say yes to collaborating on it. So, for instance, in the case of the art style and the concept art and the character designs, I worked with Mick McMahon, who is a man in his 70s, and he's one of the creators of Judge Dredd, which is, a sort of seminal UK comic book character. And Mick agreed to collaborate on this. So I went straight to the source in a way of the indie British comic book scene. I mean, he's also the biggest influence on people like Mike Mignola, the creator of Hellboy, and so his style has inspired lots and lots of artists for decades. But I wanted to get back to the roots of a guy who had essentially sort of invented in many ways, or co-invented, this sort of punk, anti-authoritarian sort of comic book style in the 70s. And I felt that now we're entering an era we have lots to fight against as well. So I thought that kind of visual tone and voice would be great. And also I did it also because I wanted to have a unique look. I wanted the game to actually stand out on a storefront and not be like all the other thumbnails out there. So that's the visual style. In terms of the music, I wanted something that feels organic and feels analog and not digital. And actually, that was the approach to everything in this game. We wanted everything to be handcrafted, because if we're going to be taking automation and being replaced by humans, by robots, heads on, and I think we can't be hypocrites about it. We have to make the game as manually and as human a way as possible. And so that was the main inspiration, as well ideas and concepts than other media.
So the game can either be played in VR or on a regular 2D screen. Did you find any difficulties with making a game that can be played through these two different mediums?
Yeah, it's extremely difficult. I mean, like the realities of the business, especially when we started working on the project a few years ago, were that there was the take up in a way for VR was still relatively low. So the idea of making a highly ambitious game only for VR was one that publishers just wouldn't want to engage with at all, which really made me angry. But so that was the reality back then. It's funny. I mean, we're talking now the day after Apple has entered the space, and of course, with a very expensive headset, but they've entered it, and they will now. Suddenly, people go like, "Oh, yeah, VR is taken off. I guess it is a real thing," and it has been for a while. I mean, it has been as real. I mean, so for people who ask me, like, "Do you think VR will ever take off?" I go like, "What do you think theater will ever take off?" Like, it's doing all right for a few creatives that have something to say and actually genuinely take advantage of the medium. I'm not a hardware manufacturer. I don't care if the thing sells 20 million, 100 million, a billion. I don't care. It's not my business, and I won't see a dime from it. And I don't care. I don't need a theater on every street. I just need a few good ones in town. But it's been difficult. But with Ryan Bausfield, the creative director at Wolf and Wood, who's a very, very keen flat or pancake, as they call it, a gamer as well. We created two parallel strands to the game, and the games are quite different. They control quite differently between the two mediums as well. But it's been a challenge, but hopefully we've met it.
Managing scope is a really important aspect of creating video games. How did you work to manage the scope of The Last Worker while you were creating the game? And how did the scope change from the first idea that you sort of had to what you now have published?
It's a good question. Our scope actually didn't diminish. It only got bigger, but it got bigger organically, not because we felt we need more content or some other nonsense. We just were like, wouldn't be great if we did this, and does this make sense, and how does this add to the story, and how does this give us more interesting gameplay mechanics that to explore, etc. So it grew organically, and it grew nicely. So we didn't actually at any point decrease the game in scope, if only it only got bigger than the original ideas and vision of it. But we didn't have feature creep either, which is of course a big problem in game development, where suddenly you go like, yeah, I'll but this, and then suddenly everyone goes in a tangent and adds a whole new layer of AI or mechanics and other stuff on top, and it makes the whole thing spiral out of control. So we didn't have that either. But our biggest scope issue was the pandemic, really, the fact that we couldn't work in the same room together, and that very often team members would fall ill and suddenly not be at the workplace or at their computers or whatever behind the desks for sometimes a week or two on end. Was that that stuff, you do that multiple times and it has quite a knock-on effect. So but no, we kept things nice and creative, nice and loose, nice and ambitious. And we're a team. We were a team. I mean, the full-time team on the game was between 7 and 8 people. So it's pretty massive for that team size, I think.
So you wrote the script and the story for the game. How did you go about weaving the plot and the gameplay together to create the game that we now have?
Well, that was interesting. I didn't start writing. I mean, I outlined the game, outlined where I want to go. And even for the detailed outline, I didn't really work on that until we had spent weeks and weeks discussing everything that we would do in the game with the team. Because I felt imposing a script on a game that will only evolve in terms of its mechanics and stuff would both hold the gameplay back, but would also make the script stand out as like a sore thumb, as it does in most games these days still. And so it was very much developed in tandem. And so I'm a terrible procrastinator. So I really put off the actual writing for the longest possible time, until eventually I could no longer wait, because we had to actually at some point record these voiceovers and start animating the characters to them, etc. But yeah, everything was done hand in hand for sure, and in tandem from the very beginning, because I didn't want to write stuff in the bubble in order for it to end up being some sort of stale cutscene that you can interact with,
Every good game needs a ton of play testing. How did you all go about doing the play testing for The Last Worker, and what sort of important pieces of information did you learn through play testing?
Oh my God, the game is really complex, and not just on the mechanical side of it, not just on the graphical side of it. but also in terms of languages, there's a lot of text, there's a lot of dialogue in the game. So the one thing the biggest takeaway is like translations always going to, and localization is going to take up a huge amount of time in a game, whether you're working with an agency and has done this 1,000 million times before, which we have as well. They're great, but things will happen. Like, for instance, I mean, certain languages, for instance, take up 3 times more space on screen and their subtitles, for instance, than others. And so how do you prepare for that? You know, do you suddenly have like 4 rows of subtitles for that language, or do you have to then span out the dialogue? And what effect does it have on all the other languages? Because you can suddenly slow down the audio, or do you have to change the audio edit depending on the language that it's in, just so you can accommodate the subtitles? So all that stuff is that is an intense one. So that I recall was the most intense part of it for us, and not necessarily fun either. But and there was some testing done by our publisher, Wired Productions. There was testing done by also at Meta, for instance, because we were working for on the Quest side. The publisher was working with sort of some external testers, and most of the testing, I would say, was done internally by the team themselves, by us playing it, and that's been a rolling sort of process throughout. But yeah, it's a tough game to test because you can fly in 6 directions at all points, and you always want to keep the story going, but at the same time you don't want the player to feel confined, so and limited. So so hopefully we've nailed it, but it's a tough one. But yeah, we got there.
So at the sort of halfway-ish point of the game, when Kurt gets the EMP gun, the gameplay shifts to have a little more focus on combat and that sort of stuff. Can you tell me about your decision to make that shift into a focus on combat at that point? A slight focus.
Yeah, I mean, the combat is quite, I don't want to spoil it too much, but I mean, it is quite limited on purpose. It's quite funny. There was actually a review of the game. It was a good review, but the one thing that they criticized was like, they weren't sure whether the activist elements, whether it's like combat and hacking and other stuff, while they felt that they weren't necessarily as quote unquote fun as the day-to-day tasks in the game, which is the working for the corporation and dispatching and recycling products, etc. And they wrote in the article, I can't quite quote it, but they said something like, and we're wondering if this was an intentional design choice. And my answer to that would be yeah. Because the game is indeed about the inner struggle that we have when we are in a bad relationship, whether it's in the workplace or in a personal relationship, whatever. What's much easier sometimes is to be unhappy and keep it going than to resist in order to actually find eventual happiness. The resistance itself is hard, which is why nobody does that. It's hard, risky. It could cost you your life. It will definitely cost you your job. And so even when you get the EMP gun, it only works for a limited period of time in the game, the way it works at first, when you feel like an absolute badass when you use it, because we felt it would be too easy to just turn this into a dumb action game where you just win. And so hopefully that is clear.
So the plan to destroy Youngle by sending Skew in with the bomb, sort of within the artwork of it, my nerdy brain kind of made a connection, and it to me seemed like it was paying homage to the Star Wars, and in that the plans to destroy the Death Star. Was that a place where you drew inspiration from, or am I just kind of making a crazy connection?
No, I mean we did think about. I think we did mention the trench battle at some point. Was it the main inspiration for it? No, because I mean when we created Skew, what happened is like I should actually show you. Hang on one sec. While we were working on it, this device was announced, the Playdate. I don't know if you know the Playdate, and it's a little portable handheld game system that makes that on which you can play games and develop games for it. And so I was quite obsessed with this little device. It was created by Panic, the people behind that published Untitled Goose Game and Firewatch, and I wanted to make a game for it. And so it's a little spin-off, literally, because you can use the crank for it. And in which you could play Skew, a little guy. Of course, by playing it while I'm not sure if I can play it in mirrored mode, but maybe you can.
Oh.
Shit. Yeah, I'm messing up. But you can tilt the okay, what the, I can't do it. I can't do. I'm actually physically incapable of playing it the way. But it's really fun. It uses the accelerometer to go left and right, and the crank to power its propeller. And I just wanted to make that little game on Playdate, and then we decided, oh, how do we put that game into the Last Worker itself? And so we also put a crank on the vehicle, on the pod. And so it was actually bizarrely, it was the arrival of this little handheld device and my desire to want to make a game for it that inspired us to this level. And yes, but if people think of Star Wars as one of the most exciting moments in the Star Wars franchise for it, then so much the better.
It's awesome. So at the end of the game, the player gets to make a series of choices that can lead them to 3 different endings. Spoiler warning for those endings. The home ending, which is the one I got, where Kurt goes home and sees his family. There's the promotion ending, where Kurt finds Youngle at his desk, and Youngle's been dead for many years. And then the revolution ending, where Kurt ends up dying along with killing Youngle. What made you decide to have the game have 3 different endings, and were there any possible endings that you thought about but ended up cutting?
That's interesting. No, I those are the 3 endings that I wanted because I wanted to, you know, it in the tone of it, you might think, oh, this game says Amazon is evil, Amazon needs to be destroyed, for instance. And while I'm not a massive fan of Amazon or Jeff Bezos for that matter, and I find a lot of these sort of big tech sociopaths are quite loathsome in themselves. I think the idea of purely using destruction in order to solve a problem is not one that's worked out very often, very well in history. And also, it's not as easy as that. You know, it's like these Amazons, etc., are as much a product of their own times as we are on the receiving end of their products, literally. So I didn't want to make some sort of crass, sort of binary, thing. It's like, oh, bad guys destroyed, cool, we win. It's always more complex than that, and I wanted to show that there's a duality to everything. Whether you join the resistance, whether you decide to stay with a job, or whether indeed you aspire to sort of build a sort of family life for yourself. All of those things have their own benefits, but they also come with their threats, and sometimes even with larger problems. So I don't know if that was clear, but maybe that didn't, for some, it might not be satisfying because they would sort of expect to have worked for a happy ending. But to me, a happy ending always inspires more of a status quo. You feel like you've achieved everything in the game, and therefore everything's going to be fine and dandy in the real world once you turn the game off. And I find that to be limiting. I think games should make us question the world that we're in, just like any other great art form does, and try and better it and improve it, rather than going, well, yeah, I've just achieved a great victory in the game, and now I can just be a passive consumer of fascism, as I have been until now.
Pretty much every game has strange or interesting ideas that were thought about or brainstormed for one point, but just ended up getting cut. What were some of those sort of ideas for The Last Worker?
Strange idea. I was in like, oh my God. I mean, the whole game is full of strange ideas. So I can't think of, I mean, if there was anything that was too strange to be in the game. I genuinely can't think of it now. It's maybe it's because I've got a game coming out 10 days from now, whatever it is, 13 days from now, that I'm blanking on it. But I mean, there would have been thousands of them, I'm sure. But it's not one I can think of at the moment. I've got too many ideas in my head all the time. It's normal for me.
So which parts of The Last Worker did you have to put the most time and effort into to get just the way you wanted it?
I mean, for me personally on the project, it will have been the voices, because there's tens of thousands of lines of dialogue in the game and words in the game, and so recording them, writing them at first, and then recording them, directing the actors in the middle of the pandemic, then selecting the right performances, and then chopping it down and editing it together and all that stuff. It took forever. I mean, we're a tiny team, and so for me, I was working with a sound engineer who edited a lot of the dialogue. I did a lot of the audio editing. Ryan Bousfield, creative director Wolfenwood, he did tons and tons of work, chopping it down even further and then like turning to file names and all this other kind of stuff and creating a whole system for it. So that took a long time. And then also timing it and making sure that it all sounds good in the game, that it all makes sense. So for me, that was super time consuming. But there's not one sort of single element in the game that has taken more time than the other. This was a constant struggle to do everything on it because there's just so much going on and so many systems that could sort of easily have cannibalized each other, but hopefully didn't. So it was a constant balancing act, and we're constantly walking on a tightrope. But it's a really challenging game, and one that we're very proud of, and it's one that people are gradually. It's not one of those games people instantly go like, I need to play this right now because this is the game I've been waiting for. It's one that sort of relies a lot on sort of word of mouth and people sort of sharing it with others. And we're hearing from lots of people that sort of really, really enjoy it, and it's talking to them. And so hopefully all this hard work has been worth it.
What was it like to create the game during the lockdown, and what were some of the struggles and difficulties of being isolated while working on the game?
I mean, the struggles were immense for all of us, but I think the one thing that was useful was that, that feeling that Kurt has working alone in this massive fulfillment center is one that we could all relate to. And so we were pouring all of the angst and all those feelings back into the game, which hopefully gives it a level of authenticity and people can relate to it when they play it. But yeah, it's been very, very hard. I mean, throughout the development, I actually physically met the team 3 times. I mean, it was in development for 3 years, which is nuts if you think about it, because we were working together every day. And we just spent hours and hours and hours on the phone and Zoom calls and other stuff every day. And it's to a point where I really kind of loathe doing Zoom calls. I mean, nothing personal. But it's like, yeah, it was a lot. And so now we meet physically at every opportunity, even though we're very much in different cities in the UK, and it's given us a bigger appreciation for the outside world, for sure. It was tough. And also the disease, the actual, whenever certain team members would catch it, it gives a big knock every single time to the project. Ryan works very well with his team in the office and has never demanded they come in, but you could see that the productivity would actually go up, and the team spirit would be higher when people were allowed to work together, jam together, laugh together. It's just different than being stuck at home alone.
Is there anything that you wish you knew before starting work on the game?
I personally would have preferred to make it for VR only, and that's because that was always the medium that I loved the most for it, and that and the Switch actually. But to me, I think of the Switch as a almost like an immersive device, because with the addition of the gyroscope or the accelerometer and stuff, and which you can use in the game to control it, it feels super immersive. So I think that would have given us a bit more focus and less stress knowing that. But other than that, also, I feel that, again, I'm very proud of the game. In fact, I'm proud it went to the Venice Film Festival. It was the only game in competition there, into the 78th. That was 2 years ago, Venice Film Festival, when it was still just the opening of the game, first 20 minutes. It's gotten great reviews. It's taken us all over the world. But it's also a game with a unique sense of humor, in which I poured a lot of my own sort of anxiety and sort of my weird quirks and things. I also understand that when you do that, when you're dealing with comedy, it's a thing that doesn't always land with people. I mean, some people don't know if you're being sarcastic or if you mean it or not, whatever. And people are also not used to games having opinions. I mean, most games are just about nothing. And so some people are actually angered by the fact that your game is trying to say anything. There's been a lot of that. And I don't regret having made a game that's about something, but also know that doing something that is satirical in tone and mixes different game genres together is one that might lose you a few players. Some people might go like, oh, I thought it was going to be a thing where you shoot things. Or, oh, why does it have to be political? Why can't I just have fun? And it's other nonsense that you would hear. Sorry, it's not an Activision game. It's not an Ubisoft title. It's its own thing. And so so that's the only regret potentially, is that I feel that we might have fallen between chairs a little bit just by being as original as we are. But I think, as I said, I think it's a game that is going to gradually gain more and more respect. I think as we have been, as people discover it and people realize, wow, this was something else.
Looking back now, is there anything that you wish you could have done differently before the launch of the game?
Well, I mean, I think we could have probably promoted it. I mean, it's a tough one. I mean, this is more of a publisher thing, but I personally always liked the conversations around the game the most, and I wanted to bring the community in more into that. And I wish, and unfortunately, I didn't have the bandwidth myself as a creative person on it and the producer of the game and stuff to plan that stuff. And I wanted to have more of a conversation around the themes with the community and with the world at large. So that is I think that's my biggest regret, that wasn't happening, but I'm not trying to get into trouble here.
What was the biggest lesson that you feel you learned from working on The Last Worker?
My biggest lesson is that video games are extremely difficult to make. They're also incredibly rewarding. I think they are the greatest art form that exists now. It's the one that brings all of them under one roof and makes them collaborate and create beautiful new things. And not only that, but also brings in the audience. It's the most democratic of art forms. And the fact that it does that, to me, what I learned is that I want to keep making games and keep making better games as well, and more beautiful and more ambitious games. I actually have a game coming out a few days from now called Sea Smash VRS, also developed with Wolf and Wood. And we've had an amazing response so far, and it's one of the most talked about VR games at the moment. It's on PlayStation VR 2, and it makes people move and play like a futuristic sport in space with incredible graphics, and it's like graphic design made physical, and people are dancing inside the game because they have a full body avatar inside the game, and it's just pure joy. And so, yes, I'm here to stay in games, and also I'm very much looking forward to combining something that both combines physical gameplay and narrative for the next title after this. So yeah, I've learned tons, and I'm now ready for an even bigger fight.
Awesome. What would be your biggest piece of advice to a newer game dev trying to get their start and go and make their first game?
Go and make your first game. It's like, just make stuff and don't ask for permission. Like, I mean, it sounds easy to say, but you don't need money to make your first game, but you need willpower. And it's incredibly intense, for sure. I mean, we certainly didn't have anywhere near the money that we needed to make this game, and I don't recommend that. But for one's first game, you want to express your ideas in as pure way as possible, and you don't need big graphics. You don't need any of that jazz. Actually, I mean, Playdate is a beautiful thing for people to check out. It's play.date, and on there, you've got dev tools that allow you to use, just scripts and other things that are, don't even require any programming skills in order to make your first game. And then you actually have a very vibrant community, like where this gorgeous piece of hardware with its unique quirks and its crank, for instance, can be used in ways that games haven't been expressed before. So just make games for the smallest device possible or the biggest. It doesn't matter, whatever your capability, but don't ask anyone for permission. Just take your stage and own it.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been great interviewing you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that was the interview. I want to thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, make sure to follow or subscribe so that you can see more content like this. Also, if you really like the show, consider giving us a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you think a friend might like the show, make sure to share it with them. If you want to stay up to date with new stuff that's going on with Game Design Hour, make sure to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or TikTok at Game Design Hour. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I can see you next time.